picture this, you've got this law, right? A law that's been sitting around since 1798, like way back when the U.S. was just getting started.
Wow, 1798,
I know, right?
it's going way back.
It is, and now here we are in 2025, and this law, the Alien Enemies Act, is suddenly, like, the hot topic.
Yeah, it's wild, isn't it? It's originally meant for, like, worries about war with France, but now it's being used in a totally different way.
Exactly, and that's what we're diving into today. The Trump administration is trying to use this 227-year-old law to deport Venezuelan migrants.
Okay.
Who they say are part of this gang called the Tren de Aragua.
Right, the Tren de Aragua.
Yeah, and they're calling it an invasion or a predatory incursion.
Strong words.
Very strong. And here's the kicker. It's the first time this Alien Enemies Act has been used since World War II.
It really makes you think about how executive power can change over time, right? Like what flew back then might raise eyebrows now.
Totally. And that's what makes this so interesting for our listeners. They want to get to the bottom of this quickly and understand what's going on. So in this deep dive, we're going to break down everything. The key events, the legal arguments, the whole shebang.
That's good.
We've done our homework, looked at tons of sources, and trust me, there are some pretty surprising things in there and some very different viewpoints too.
I bet.
So first things first. What exactly is this Alien Enemies Act all about?
Okay, so basically, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, it gives the executive branch a lot of power in times of war when things are kind of like war.
Okay.
The important thing here is that it lets them apprehend, detain, and remove any non-citizen from a country that's considered hostile.
Hostile meaning?
Like if the U.S. is at war with them, and this is what's being argued now, if they're doing what the Act calls an invasion or a predatory incursion against the U.S.
So it's not just about an official war declaration then?
Right, it's that predatory incursion part that the Trump administration is latching onto.
And this is where things get a little dicey because this act says you can deport people without them even getting a hearing before a judge.
Yeah, that's a big deal, right? It kind of sidesteps the usual legal processes you'd see in immigration cases.
Huge difference. So we got this old law that's being dusted off, and it has some pretty serious implications for due process.
Exactly, and that's why it's facing so much pushback legally.
Yeah.
Up until now, this act had only been used 3 times in U.S. history, and all during actual declared wars.
Really?
Yeah, so this is definitely uncharted territory.
Okay, so we've got a handle on the law itself. Now, why is the Trump administration saying this Tren de Aragua gang situation warrants pulling out this 227-year-old law? What's their logic?
Well, President Trump made a proclamation basically saying that this gang fits the bill for an invasion or a predatory incursion.
Mm-hmm.
And get this, they're claiming, and this is where it gets a little shaky, that these gang members are secretly taking orders from the Venezuelan government under Nicolas Maduro.
Whoa, hold on. So they're saying the Venezuelan government is behind this whole thing, using this game to mess with the U.S.?
That's their argument. And they're using it to justify this invading force idea. But here's the thing. Reports are saying that U.S. intelligence agencies didn't back up that claim about Maduro's direct involvement.
So that direct link between the gang and the Venezuelan government might be a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, it does make you wonder how strong their whole argument is if the intelligence doesn't support it, right?
Definitely raises some questions. So let's talk about the pushback. Enter Judge James Boasberg, who steps in and issues a temporary restraining order. What was his main concern with all this?
Well, the big thing for him was due process. He said that these Venezuelan migrants, they weren't getting a fair shake. They didn't have a chance to say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not in this gang, or to fight their deportation based on this Alien Enemies Act.
So he's not saying the gang isn't dangerous or anything like that. He's more concerned with the process of deciding who's actually in the game and if this law should even apply in this situation.
No, right. It's about making sure things are done fairly.
Mm-hmm.
He actually said that there's a strong public interest in preventing the mistaken deportation of people based on categories they have no right to challenge.
That's a powerful statement. It highlights the possibility of people being deported without any real chance to defend themselves.
Exactly. And on top of that, he's even looking into whether his order to stop deportations was actually followed, especially with those flights that were already on their way to El Salvador when he made the ruling.
Wow, so he's really trying to make sure things are done by the book. As you might expect, the Trump administration appealed that decision, but then the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals also decided to uphold Judge Boasberg's temporary block. What were the main points that convinced them?
The appeals court basically agreed with Judge Boasberg, saying it seemed likely the Venezuelan migrants' rights were violated. They voted 2-1.
Okay.
Judge Patricia Millett was pretty outspoken about it. She slammed the government's plan, calling it a removal scheme that doesn't even offer a tiny bit of due process.
Harsh words.
Yeah, she basically said they had no warning, no hearings, and no chance to prove they weren't in the gang, or to even use legal protections against being sent somewhere dangerous or where they might be tortured. She even compared the lack of due process to what Nazis got, which is a pretty serious comparison.
It is. So clearly she's deeply concerned about fairness here. What about Judge Henderson? What did she think?
She also agreed to keep the block in place, but she focused more on whether the Alien Enemies Act even applied in this case.
Okay.
She wasn't convinced that just migrating to the U.S. was enough to call it an invasion or a predatory incursion. Like, those words usually mean something more like a military attack.
Right, some kind of organized hostile action.
Exactly. And she also shut down the argument that the courts couldn't touch this case because it involved foreign relations. She said, and I quote, "Sensitive subject matter alone does not shroud a law from the judicial eye."
So she's basically saying the courts have a duty to step in, even when things get sensitive, especially when someone's rights are on the line.
Right on. So most of the appeals court was on board with pausing the deportations. But there was one dissenting voice, Judge Justin Walker. What did he have to say? Judge Walker had two main issues. First, he thought the case shouldn't have been in D.C. because the migrants were being held in Texas. He said it should have been filed there.
Ah, a procedural argument.
Yeah. And second, he was more worried about what the Trump administration was saying about the order harming international relations and national security.
So he basically gave more weight to the executive branch's concerns.
Right. He thought the potential risks were bigger than the others did. Now, on top of all this case also brings up the whole state secrets privilege. For our listeners who might not be familiar with that, can you break it down and tell us why it matters here?
Sure, think big.
Okay, so the state secrets privilege, it's this legal thing that lets the government keep certain information secret during a trial if they think releasing it would hurt national security intelligence stuff or foreign relations.
So like a get-out-of-jail-free card for secrets?
Kinda. It's meant to protect really important secrets, even if they could be important to the case.
I see.
So in this case, the Trump administration used this privilege to avoid giving Judge Boasberg more details about the deportation flights. They said it would mess things up with other countries and put national security at risk.
So who exactly in the administration made that call about keeping those secrets?
From what we've seen, it was Attorney General Pam Bondi, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. They all gave signed statements to the judge saying why they thought this information needed to stay under wraps.
Okay, so they're claiming it's all about national security. But this privilege seems pretty powerful. Is there any worry about it being misused?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of legal experts are worried about that. Some people, like Ashley Deeks, have said that the government might use it to hide things that are illegal or just embarrassing, not just to protect actual national security stuff.
Well, it could be a way to cover up wrongdoing.
Potentially. And, George Kroner said it really well. He talked about the tectonic plates of executive privilege and judicial responsibility, meaning there's this constant tension between the government's power to keep secrets and the court's duty to make sure things are fair and transparent.
And when you add the state secrets privilege into the mix, it just makes it that much harder for the courts to do their job.
Exactly. So where does all this leave us politically? What's the fallout from all this back and forth?
Well, the White House has said they're going to appeal all the way to the Supreme Court. But the thing is, it's not that common for the Supreme Court to take on appeals of temporary restraining orders like this one.
Right. Those don't usually make it that far.
Exactly. And all this has really ramped up the tension between the White House and the federal courts. President Trump and some of his supporters have even been calling for Judge Boasberg to be impeached just for making that initial ruling. Yeah, it was a pretty big deal. It even got Chief Justice John Roberts to speak out, which is rare. He basically said that impeachment shouldn't be used as a weapon against judges who make unpopular decisions. It was a strong defense of judicial independence.
Makes sense. You need the courts to be able to do their job without fear of political backlash.
Absolutely. And on top of all that, Judge Boasberg is still digging for information about whether his order was actually followed, with those flights that were already in the air.
Right. That's still up in the air.
Pun intended, but yeah, he's not letting that go. He wants to know if the administration really did stop the deportations when he told them to.
So there's a lot still to unfold.
Oh yeah, this is definitely not over.
Yeah.
So to sum things up for our listeners, the Trump administration tried to use this really old law to deport some Venezuelan migrants, saying they were part of a dangerous gang. This sparked a whole legal battle, mostly about whether they were being treated fairly, and so far the courts have sided with the migrants, putting a stop to the deportations, at least for now.
And on top of that, the whole state secrets thing just throws another wrench into the works. It's a messy situation.
Very messy. But hopefully our listeners now have a much clearer picture of what's going on with this case and all the different angles involved. It really is a fascinating look at how our legal and political systems work, especially when they bump up against each other.
Definitely. And it raises some big questions for everyone to think about. Like, what happens when you use laws meant for wartime during peacetime? Is the threat from a gang really the same as a threat from another country? And what does this whole thing say about the balance of power between the president and the courts?
Big questions indeed.
Huge ones. And how does the government keeping secrets impact transparency and accountability in a democracy? It really makes you think about individual rights versus national security in our world today.
Lots to ponder for sure.
Absolutely.